5 disasters, 5 places, an airport, a cruise ship, a hotel, a reactor, and the world's highest peak. Different years. Everyone began with a mistake so small, almost nobody noticed it. A misunderstood sentence, a shortcut, a design change, an ignored warning, a decision to keep going. Why did ordinary people ignore the warning signs until it was too late? 5 small mistakes. The question isn't how these disasters happened. The real question is, why did ordinary people ignore the warning signs until it was too late? And it makes you wonder, how many times have you ignored a gut feeling simply because you trusted the system? Chapter 1. The Wrong Radio Call. March 27, 1977. 2 Boeing 747s waited, hidden inside a blanket of fog. Neither crew knew they were about to become part of the deadliest aviation disaster in history. One ordinary radio transmission, one ordinary reply, and one decision that lasted only a few seconds. None of the passengers knew it, but in less than a minute, 583 people would lose their lives. Not because of an engine failure, not because of bad weather alone, not because of terrorism, but because one message was never fully understood. How can a single misunderstood sentence destroy 2 of the largest passenger aircraft ever built? And perhaps an even bigger question: why didn't anyone stop it? This is the story of the deadliest aviation disaster in history, the Tenerife airport disaster. But before we blame the pilots, we need to answer the first question. Why were 2 Boeing 747s even at this small airport? The answer begins nearly 120 kilometers away. Earlier that day, a bomb exploded at Gran Canaria Airport. Authorities immediately shut the airport. Every incoming aircraft suddenly needed somewhere else to land. That somewhere was Tenerife, an airport never designed to handle so many jumbo jets. Aircraft were parked wherever space could be found. Taxiways became crowded. Pilots waited for hours. The airport wasn't broken, it was overwhelmed. And that pressure quietly set the stage for everything that followed. Then nature made everything worse. A thick blanket of Atlantic fog rolled across the runway. So here's another question. If 2 giant aircraft were heading toward each other, why didn't they simply see one another? Because they couldn't. Visibility dropped so dramatically that the crews could barely see beyond a few hundred meters. But here's something even more surprising. Neither could the control tower. Today, air traffic controllers can track every aircraft on radar. Back then, Tenerife had no ground radar at all. The controller wasn't watching a screen. He was listening to voices, trying to imagine where each airplane was. Now comes the moment that changed history. Many people believe the KLM captain simply ignored instructions, but that's not exactly what happened. So what did he actually hear? The captain had received permission for his departure route, but not permission to begin takeoff. Then, just as another aircraft transmitted, "We're still taxiing down the runway." The control tower began speaking at the exact same moment. The 2 radio signals collided. Inside the KLM cockpit, the warning disappeared beneath a burst of static. One sentence, one fraction of a second, one final opportunity, lost forever. But surely, someone inside the cockpit questioned the decision, and someone did. The flight engineer looked ahead, uncertain, then quietly asked, "Is he not clear? That Pan American?" It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a warning, just one simple question. The captain immediately replied, "Oh yes." No one challenged him again. Today, aviation experts call this one of the greatest examples of authority gradient. It's remaining silent after asking the right one. Drop a comment below. Have you ever stayed silent at work or school when you knew a leader was making a mistake? What happened? Sometimes, the most dangerous mistake isn't saying the wrong thing. It's remaining silent after asking the right one. 583 lives, 1 moment left. At nearly 260 kilometers per hour, the KLM captain pulled back on the controls, desperately trying to lift over the Pan Am aircraft. For a split second, it almost worked. Almost. The 2 Boeing 747s collided. 583 people were killed. Only 61 passengers survived, all from the Pan Am aircraft. The Tenerife disaster changed aviation forever. Pilots now use standardized radio phraseology. Crew members are trained to challenge captains when something feels wrong. Ground radar became standard, because history proved something terrifying. Disasters rarely begin with one catastrophic mistake. They begin with ordinary people making ordinary decisions that quietly line up until there's no time left to stop them. One misunderstood radio call changed aviation forever. But sometimes, the smallest mistake isn't spoken over a radio. It's just a single line on a navigation map, drawn where it shouldn't be. Chapter 2. The captain who took one shortcut. In the previous chapter, hundreds of lives were changed by a misunderstood radio transmission. This time, there was no confusion, no communication breakdown, no equipment failure, just one decision, one shortcut, made by the person everyone trusted most. Because sometimes, the greatest danger isn't a machine, it's human confidence. On January 13, 2012, more than 4,200 people boarded a routine Mediterranean cruise. Everything was normal, calm, and clear. How can one of the safest forms of travel end in disaster on a perfectly calm night? The answer was standing on the bridge. It was simply a choice. A shortcut measured in a few hundred meters that would soon cost far more than anyone imagined. If the captain knew the waters, why didn't he avoid the rocks? Because charts can never replace judgment. Without warning, a massive underwater reef ripped through the hull. More than 50 meters of steel was torn open. Thousands of tons of seawater began flooding inside. Electric systems failed. The ship lost power and precious time. Why didn't everyone evacuate? Because the danger wasn't announced. Passengers were told there was only an electrical problem. Many returned to their cabins or continued dinner. They believed it was under control, while the ship took on water. By the time the order was given, the vessel leaned heavily to one side. Launching lifeboats became nearly impossible. Thankfully, an extraordinary rescue effort saved thousands. But 32 people never made it home. It wasn't a storm. It was one unnecessary decision that triggered a chain reaction impossible to reverse. When confidence turns into complacency, even a small shortcut can become a catastrophe. Next, the smallest mistake isn't made by a captain. It's made by a single engineer, with a single overlooked detail. Chapter 3. One design change. One misunderstood radio call changed aviation forever. One unnecessary shortcut sank a luxury cruise ship. But the next disaster didn't happen in the sky or at sea. It happened inside a beautiful hotel, not because something broke unexpectedly, but because someone believed one small design change wouldn't matter. On the evening of July 17, 1981, more than 1,600 people gathered inside the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City. A dance competition filled the lobby with music, laughter, and spectators watching from suspended walkways above. Everything looked perfectly safe. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing seemed unusual. So here's the first question. How can a structure that looks perfectly normal suddenly collapse without warning? The answer wasn't hidden in the concrete. It wasn't hidden in the steel. It was hidden inside a construction drawing. During construction, the original design called for one continuous steel hanger rod supporting both walkways, but fabricators suggested a simpler approach. Instead of one long rod, they proposed using two shorter rods. On paper, the change looked insignificant. It made manufacturing easier. Installation became simpler. The drawings were approved. But here's the question no one asked. What happens when a small design change also changes where the weight is carried? The answer was devastating. The revised design doubled the force placed on the connection supporting the upper walkway. A detail measured in inches had quietly transformed into a fatal weakness, and almost nobody realized it. Then came the moment everything changed. As hundreds of people watched the dance below, the overloaded connection finally gave way. The upper walkway collapsed first, crashing directly onto the lower walkway beneath it. The second walkway couldn't survive the impact. It collapsed too. In just a few seconds, tons of steel and concrete fell into a crowded hotel lobby. There was no warning, no alarm, no time to run. Another question. Could anyone have survived? Many did. But for others, there was simply nowhere to escape. The collapse claimed 114 lives. More than 200 people were injured. At the time, it became one of the deadliest structural failures in American history, not because the building was old, not because of an earthquake, not because of poor materials, but because one approved design change had quietly doubled the load on a critical connection. The Hyatt Regency disaster permanently changed the engineering profession. It became a case study taught in universities around the world. Engineers were reminded that every design change, no matter how small, must be carefully analyzed, because drawings don't fail, assumptions do. Sometimes, the most dangerous mistake is the one that looks too small to question. 3 disasters, 3 different industries: aviation, maritime, engineering, and yet, they all share one terrifying pattern: a tiny decision, followed by a chain reaction. But the next story proves something even more unsettling. Sometimes, the smallest mistake isn't made during construction. It's made inside a nuclear reactor, where one ignored warning can affect millions. Chapter 4. One dangerous test. A misunderstood radio call changed aviation forever. One unnecessary shortcut sank a luxury cruise ship. One tiny design change brought down an entire hotel walkway. But this time, there wasn't just one mistake. There were dozens, each one small enough to seem harmless. Each one ignored, until there was nothing left to stop the disaster. This is the story of Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, engineers at reactor number 4 prepared for what should have been a routine safety test. That raises the first question. How can a safety test become one of history's worst nuclear disasters? Because the test itself wasn't the problem. The way it was conducted was. The purpose was simple. Could the reactor still produce enough electricity for a few seconds after losing external power? It sounded like a responsible safety check. But almost immediately, things began going wrong. So what happened first? The reactor's power unexpectedly dropped much lower than planned. At that point, the safest decision was obvious. Stop the test, reset everything, try again another day. So why didn't they stop? Because the schedule mattered more than the warning signs. Instead of shutting down, the operators continued. One safety rule had already been ignored. But here's the real question. If the reactor was becoming unstable, weren't there systems designed to protect it? Yes, there were. And that's exactly what makes this disaster so shocking. To keep the test running, several automatic safety systems were deliberately disabled, not because they had failed, because they were getting in the way. Imagine removing the brakes from a car, just to see how fast it can go. That's essentially what happened. One protection after another was switched off. Then came the final question. When they realized something was wrong, why didn't the emergency shutdown save the reactor? Because by then, it was already too late. The emergency shutdown button was pressed. It should have stopped everything. Instead, a design flaw inside the reactor combined with the unstable conditions already created. Power surged instead of falling. Seconds later, 2 massive explosions tore through reactor number 4. The roof was blown away. Radioactive material was launched high into the atmosphere. A disaster that would spread across Europe had begun. Could this disaster have been prevented? Investigators believe yes, not by changing one button, not by inventing new technology, but simply by following procedures that already existed. Stopping the test when conditions became unsafe. Keeping the safety systems active. Refusing to ignore warning after warning. Sometimes, catastrophes don't happen because people don't know the rules. They happen because people convince themselves the rules don't matter this time. Chernobyl transformed nuclear safety around the world. It exposed dangerous reactor design flaws. It changed how operators are trained. It strengthened international reporting and emergency procedures. But perhaps its greatest lesson is much simpler. The disaster wasn't caused by one catastrophic decision. It was caused by a series of ordinary decisions, each one crossing a safety line that should never have been crossed. Because the most dangerous mistake is believing, just this once, nothing will happen. 4 disasters, 4 different industries: aviation, maritime, engineering, nuclear power, and yet they all reveal the same truth. Disasters rarely begin with a single catastrophic event. They begin with small choices that seem harmless until it's too late. The mountain that gives one chance. A misunderstood radio call changed aviation forever. One unnecessary shortcut sank a luxury cruise ship. One overlooked design change collapsed an entire hotel walkway. A series of ignored safety rules turned a nuclear safety test into history's worst reactor disaster. But the final story has no engines, no steel, no control room, just a mountain that never forgives hesitation. On May 10th, 1996, dozens of climbers began their final push toward the summit of Mount Everest. Months of preparation, years of dreaming, had led to this moment. So here's the first question. If these were some of the world's most experienced climbers, how could so many become trapped on the same mountain? The answer wasn't a lack of skill, it was a lack of time. Before every summit attempt, guides set a strict turnaround time. A simple rule: no matter how close you are, if you haven't reached the summit by that hour, you turn back. Not because you failed, because the mountain decides the schedule, not the climber. But here's the real question. If everyone knew the rule, why didn't they follow it? Because turning back is one of the hardest decisions a human being can make. Some climbers had spent years saving money for this expedition. Others believed the summit was only minutes away. There were delays caused by bottlenecks on the route. Every minute lost made the climb more dangerous, yet many kept going. Each person thinking, "We're almost there. We still have time." But the mountain wasn't waiting. Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy. When you've invested so much time and money into a goal, you'd rather risk your life than walk away empty-handed. So what changed? The weather. A powerful storm swept across Everest. Visibility collapsed. Temperatures plunged. Hurricane-force winds battered climbers who were already exhausted and running dangerously low on oxygen. The route they had climbed just hours earlier became almost impossible to find. Every step demanded more strength than many had left. Could they still have survived? Some did, through extraordinary courage, teamwork, and rescue efforts carried out in impossible conditions. But 8 climbers lost their lives during the storm. Not because Everest suddenly became dangerous. Everest had always been dangerous. The difference was that a series of small delays, and the belief that there was just a little more time, left them on the mountain when the storm arrived. Sometimes, the deadliest decision isn't taking one more step. It's deciding not to turn back. Every disaster we've explored today looks completely different. A plane, a ship, a building, a nuclear reactor, a mountain. Yet every one of them shares the same pattern. None of them began with disaster. They began with a decision, a misunderstood radio call, a shortcut that wasn't necessary, a design change that looked harmless, safety rules that were ignored, a deadline that felt flexible. Each one seemed small, each one felt manageable, until it wasn't. History rarely changes because of one enormous event. More often, it changes because ordinary people make ordinary choices, believing, "This will be fine." And that's the lesson these disasters leave behind. The smallest mistake can create consequences no one ever imagined.